Gospel according to John is a very unique gospel compared to the other three gospels that are found within the New Testament. John uses a lot of mystical language. He uses a lot of symbolisms. He calls miracles as signs. He has a very different understanding about all that Jesus did. Many a times he uses several literary techniques that are very unique to him. His language is very polished. Philosophically, he is very sound. And he is the one who tells us that Jesus did ministry for 3 years as he came 3 times to Jerusalem. So, John's gospel becomes very important to us along with the other 3 gospel accounts. John is not simply interested in telling the story of Jesus from his birth to his death. Rather, John is interested in telling some more greater truth about Jesus, the one who has incarnated, taking the human flesh. He wants to explain the true identity and the mystery of Jesus' origin through his gospel account. John, whose name appears in the title, as we find in the Bible, the Gospel according to John, his identity is disputed. Traditionally, the church has believed that it has been written by John the Apostle, who is also known as the beloved disciple. In the 2nd century, Irenaeus mentions that John, the disciple of Lord, who was leaning on his breast, also published the gospel while living in Ephesus in Asia. So the earliest tradition of the church is very clear that a faceless figure who is mentioned as a beloved disciple in the gospel is actually John's technique of referring to himself. But the problem is that this figure who is called beloved disciple appears to be in the ministry of Jesus along with him only when he is in Jerusalem. This creates a problem. Why it is so? If John the Apostle is the beloved disciple, why this beloved disciple appears only in relation to the events that took place in Jerusalem? Where was he on the other occasions? Why he does not appear with others in the stories that has happened outside of Jerusalem? This is a riddle before us. But we know one thing, that the tradition is very strong. 2nd century papyri 66 and the 3rd century papyri 72 entitles this gospel as the gospel according to John. But the modern critics have rejected such a consensus in the history of the church about the authorship of the gospel. The modern scholars have believed that the gospel is written in a very sophisticated Greek language and also uses a lot of philosophical categories, which is very unusual or unlikely to expect from an uneducated fisherman like John, who was the apostle of Christ Jesus. So scholars have argued that this is not written from Ephesus by John the Apostle, but it was written from Galilee, and the gospel narration takes place in Judea. Acts chapter 4 verse 13 tells us that John the disciple was unschooled, an ordinary man, about whom even the Jewish leaders knew. He is a person who is known as the son of thunder, and to expect such a mystical document originating from him is very unlikely. He serves a very kind treatment to the Samaritans in John chapter 4. But then in Luke account, Luke 9:54, we know that he was one among those who desired that upon the rejection of Jesus in Samaria, may the fire be brought down from heaven and the people may be killed. John in Synoptic Gospel account doesn't seem to be sympathetic towards the Samaritans. Instead, he appears to be quite antagonistic. The recent scholars thus conclude that it must be a John other than John the Apostle who was a Palestinian Jew. And evidence in support of this that they bring is that there is a lot of parallel that we find between John's Gospel and the Qumran documents. A lot of linguistic similarity and a lot of influence of Qumran thinking can be found in this. He also mentions about the expulsion of Christians from the synagogue in chapter 9, verse 12, chapter 12, verse 42. However, the tradition also tells us that John the Apostle had migrated at a later stage from Palestine and had resettled in Ephesus, where he founded a school. There, he was known as the elder. It is in this context that 2nd and 3rd John's authorship also must be understood. The author there identifies himself as the elder. It might mean that he merely is referring to himself as an elder in the local church, but it is unlikely because those who support the apostolic origin of these letters and the Gospel of John would argue that if he was the elder of a local church, how could he write such a letter with lot of authority in addressing the churches beyond his local setting? In addition to this, there is an evidence that Papias says that the 12 were also known as the elders. Eusebius mentions of 2 Johns, but some others think that Papias was mentioning only one, which Eusebius thought as 2. In that case, the elder should be identified as the disciple of Jesus Christ. But this debate is very complex. Scholars have no consensus. But broadly, scholars have rejected the apostolic origin of John's Gospel as well as his 3 epistles. Thus, many scholars would accept that John's Gospel was written by someone who was named John, who may be an elder, but basing his writing upon the materials that are available from John the Apostle himself. So that is the reason that this Gospel is bearing the apostolic authority behind it. Although the author may be John the Elder, as some scholars would argue, and not the Apostle John himself, it has the apostolic authority because from the Johannine community or the Johannine school that John had established in Ephesus towards the end of the 1st century, that one of the leaders named John the Elder takes these documents available from the apostle in rewriting that with much more polished language, but in line with the teachings of the apostle to send the gospel to other people. If John the Apostle's authorship is accepted, then some have argued that the 4th Gospel must be dated before AD 70. Why? Simply because it portrays Jesus with primitive traits. That means he is called by name Jesus. He is addressed as Rabbi. He is addressed as teacher. So it must be dated before AD 70. They also argue that chapter 5 verse 2 alludes to the temple and the other buildings in Jerusalem as still standing. That means it cannot be dated after AD 70 because by AD 70, Titus had destroyed this temple completely, and the author cannot think that the building is still standing. Moreover, if there is a lot of Qumran influence upon the writings, then the Qumran community came to an end, as we know, by AD 70. So then there cannot be a lot of influence that we find. But this early date of John's Gospel is disputed, whether we maintain apostolic authority behind the Gospel and the letters, or we ascribe it to John the Elder, who must have gathered material from John the Apostle and must have written this Gospel and the letters in his name. Even if it is dated after AD 70, it is not necessary that John the Apostle must have died by now. The tradition says that he was still alive and he had resettled in Ephesus. After AD 70, he must have been very old, because of which he may have needed the assistance of John the Elder, who must have written his gospel and the letters for the apostle. That is why the language may be different. It may be much more polished philosophically, and a lot of influence of John the Elder's ability could be seen there. But one thing is clear, even if it is dated after 70, it should not be dated after AD 100, simply because early 2nd century evidences prove that John's gospel was still in circulation among them. And the earliest manuscript available of the New Testament to us is of John's gospel. And it will take it as early as around AD 120 or 125. So it should not be dated much later than AD 100. Then where would we place it? The most probable date, whether it is written by John the Apostle himself or by John the Elder, it should be dated somewhere around AD 85 to 90. It cannot be later than 90, because after this we know that Revelation has been written and at least the 3 letters have been written by the same author. If AD 85 to 90 is the time when this gospel was written, then it is much more reliable, because, as I mentioned earlier, the author is very clear in mentioning that by now Christians were put out of the synagogues. In chapter 9 verse 22 and chapter 12 verse 24, they are cast out. In the story of the blind man, it is very clear that he is thrown out of the synagogue, but his parents are also afraid in confessing Jesus as the healer. So there is betrayal happening by his own parents before the Jewish leaders in denying their son, who is very clear in his words that it is Jesus who has healed him. But parents do not want to accept. Rather, they say that he is of age. Let him say who has healed. But for sure, he is our son. This is a reflection to the complex situation that was taking place when John was writing this gospel. If the parting of the way that we discuss in the New Testament is a process, then it had started very early in Acts of the Apostles itself, where Jews were trying to push out Christians from the umbrella of the Jewish religion and exposing them to the imperial threat. But Christians continued for a longer period of time along with Jews under the same umbrella of Judaism as a religion. But the process, as it went ahead, took a very violent shape. And after AD 70, it became much more faster, where the two groups had to move away separately, and then their identity had to be defined separately. Probably around AD 85 or 87, if the process that was happening around the place called Jamnia, where the Jewish leaders must have regrouped, and they were now trying to resettle themselves in the light of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and they were getting reorganized in teaching and in making sure that Jewish teachings are carried out faithfully to others. They were also trying to make their difference very clear before others from the Jewish Christians. So Jewish Christians were pushed out, separated, and Christians had to now affirm their identity. That is why in John's Gospel, we clearly find they versus us. Us about Christians and they about the Jewish leaders. It is not all about the difference between the Jews or all the Jews, but definitely it is the word they refers to those who are now in authority and were trying to push out Christians from Judaism and from the protection that was given by the Roman Empire to the Jews. So there is a scuffle taking place between Jews, those who wanted to push out Christians, and Christians who had a Jewish heritage and wanted to somehow hold on to that, but continue to believe in Jesus the Messiah. So the situation fits very well because the persecution of the time of Domitian that happened post 90 is not reflected in the gospel. But at the same time, in the gospel, there is enough evidence that the separation from Judaism was taking place. Keeping in the light of these two possible situations towards the end of the first century, it is much more probable for us to conclude that it was written somewhere around 85 to 90. If it is written around 85 to 90 or 85 to 88 or so, this must have been written from Ephesus, where John was already there. But there are people who have argued that it is written from Alexandria or from even Antioch in Syria. But those opinions have not received much attention among scholars. The situation or the life situation of the community is that they are now encountering certain form of teachings that are wrong on Christology, and some of these teachings have later on got merged into the larger umbrella that we know as Gnosticism. So some of the German scholars like Bultmann, who has argued that John chapter 1, the prologue, was written in a polemic way against the Gnostic tendencies in the Johannine community, we may say that although it may not be against directly the Gnostics, but some form of teaching which had actually separated Jesus from his human identity and made him completely divine, and had a tendency of turning him into totally as a phantom who comes from above, resides for some time and goes back. John is trying to correct them by saying that no, he was really incarnated in flesh, but his origin goes back even before the time he was born through a woman named Mary. There were false teachings spreading in this community, primarily in relation to Jesus' identity and the understanding of Christ. John is trying to rectify some of those things. There is also very clear that the occasion required that John, in some sense, wanted to give a different sort of understanding about Jesus and a Christian's walk with him. How the believers in Ephesus must be relating with him. That is why scholars have said various theories they have proposed. Some have said that John wanted to supplement the three Gospels with his much more mystical explanation of Jesus and his life. Some others said, no, three Gospels and other Gospels were so inferior in its theology, and John was dissatisfied, and he wanted to replace them with a more excellent Gospel narrative that he is now trying to give through his story. Or there could be even that some of the false teachers like Nicolaitans and Cerinthians, as Irenaeus would tell us, were raising false teachings, and John was trying to rectify. But in John's own word, John is saying that my purpose is much more evangelistic. In John chapter 20, verse 30, he says that there could be many more things written, but what is written is with the only purpose that you may come to believe. The interest is that the readers, after reading the entire gospel, may believe in Jesus, who for John is God himself, who has incarnated into human form and is now the Savior of humanity. He is the Son of God, and he wants his readers to end the book by believing in this Jesus whom he is introducing. So John probably in his own words had a very evangelistic intention in writing this gospel. So in this sense, we will conclude that probably John the Elder wrote this gospel and the three letters, and the letters he wrote addressing particular situation in the church, and even one is addressed to the elect lady. He is writing with authority to them, and he draws his material from John the Apostle, probably because John has become very old. John the elder must be helping him to write his thoughts to his people. Thank you.